morning and thanks for joining us on the Gallery TV newspaper review this morning. I am Titilayo Olamide. I have the Punch newspaper, I have the Daily Sun newspaper, I have the Nigerian Tribune, and of course the Nation newspaper. And then I have another one, that's the Daily Independent newspaper, and of course the Guardian newspaper this morning. But starting with, I'll be going with the Punch newspaper. And on the major news headline, I have e-transmission of results. E-transmission of results. It says Buhari aides defense rejection. NBA order says resolution illegal and selfish. Buhari aides defense rejection. NBA order says resolution illegal and selfish. And the Senate listened to Communications Commission cited risk of backing, says Ojudu. And the National Assembly has tagged INEC and belittled Electoral Commission, and that is coming from the NBA. And any legislation that whistles down INEC's independency unconstitutional, and that is coming from the Suns. And all these stories can be found on page 2 of the Punch newspaper this morning. And then I move above the major news headline. It says telecommunication sectors deplete forest by 10.8 billion US dollars in 5 years. Telecommunication sectors depletes forest by 10.8 billion US dollars in 5 years. And the stories can be found on page 27 inside the Punch newspaper this morning. Down below it is on page 26. On page 26, it says external reserves drops by 180 million US dollars in 2 weeks. External reserves dropped by 180 million US dollars in 2 weeks, and the stories can be found on page 20. And the next to read is on page 27. On page 27 inside the Punch newspaper, I have ECOWAS counsel Nigeria to raise VAT on hotels and others. ECOWAS counsel Nigeria to raise VAT on hotel and others, and the story can be found on page 27 inside the Punch newspaper this morning. And then I move to still on page 27. It says federal government plans 12.3 billion naira subsidy for 2 million farmers. Federal government plans 12.3 billion naira subsidy for 2 million farmers, and the stories can be found on page 17 inside the Punch newspaper this morning. And then I move to page 8. It says CCT chair sues Senate victim questions National Assembly's power. CCT chair sues Senate victim questions National Assembly's power. You can turn into page 9 of the Punch newspaper to find more on that story. And the next read is on page 45. Page 45 says APC chairmanship. That's an issue about the APC chairmanship. Says Yari dismisses alleged gang up by former governors. Yari dismisses alleged gang up by former governor. You can turn into page 45 of the Punch newspaper this morning to find more on that story. And then still on the fourth page newspaper reviews this morning, it says commuters groan as ram sellers buyers block Lagos Ibadan expressway. You can see the picturesque story of commuters, and then that of the ram and the great block that held a lot of people down yesterday towards their journey moving out of Lagos, and those also coming into Lagos from Ibadan. And that story can be found on page 4 and 5 of the Punch newspaper this morning. I move below it, and that's on page 5. It says 16 killed in Oshu crashes, FRSC blames wrong overtaking. 16 killed in Oshu crashes, and FRSC blames wrong overtaking. You can turn into page 6 of the Punch newspaper this morning to find more on that story. And still on page 6 of the Punch newspaper this morning, say court fixes Igboho's 8th trial for Salah Day. Court fixes Igboho's 8th trial for Salah Day, and that is coming from Igboho's lawyer. You can read more on that on page 5 of the Punch newspaper this morning. And then I move to page 10 and page 11. On page 11, command goes after Zamfara gunmen as bandits kill 13 policemen. Command goes after Zamfara gunmen as bandits kill 13 policemen. You can turn into page 11 of the Punch newspaper this morning to read more on that story. And still on the front page newspaper headlines this morning on the Gallery TV says Makinde running one-man show mismanaging insecurity. Makinde running one-man show mismanaging insecurity, and that is coming from Ibadan Monarch. You can turn into page 11 of the Punch newspaper this morning to read more on that story. And then I have on page 4 and 5 this morning on the Punch newspaper front page headlines. It says Lagos Assembly CSO orders brutalized lawyer over Consul suit, and that's on page 4 and 5 of the Punch newspaper this morning. And then lastly on the front page stories of the Punch newspaper this morning, and that's on page 16. It says River Basin writes Sanwo-Olu Abiodun on Oyo Dam's water release. River Basin writes Sanwo-Olu Abiodun on Oyo Dam's water release. You can find more on that story on page 16 of the Punch newspaper this morning. And then with that, I move to Daily Sun newspaper this morning. And on the major news headline, it says Presidency knocks Bishop Kukah hard. Presidency knocks Bishop Kukah hard. Calls priest disappointment for allegedly castigating Nigeria before foreigners. Calls priest disappointment for allegedly castigating Nigeria before foreigners. And that's the we can be found on page 26 of the Daily Sun newspaper this morning. And then I move above the major news headline, and that's on page 2. It says federal government should reinstate Alete oil field to Bayelsa firm. Federal government should reinstate the Alete oil field to Bayelsa firm JV partners, and that is promoters. That is coming from the promoters of oil firms, and you can read more on that story on page 2 of the Daily Sun newspaper this morning. And then moving below the news headlines, it says 70 killed, 2 injured in Osun Lagos road crashes. 70 killed, 2 injured in Osun Lagos road crashes. It says state police agitation invitation to anarchy. State police agitation invitation to anarchy, and that is coming from Suram, and that story can be found on page 6 and 17 of the Daily Sun newspaper this morning. Still below the major news headline, it says, and that is coming from on the case of Nnamdi Kanu. It says Ohanaeze groups in UK march against Igbo genocide July 24th. Ohanaeze groups in UK march against Igbo genocide July 24th. And that story is can be found on page 6 of the Daily Sun newspaper this morning. And I'm still on the front page newspaper stories this morning, and that's still with the Daily Sun newspaper. It says 36 state bishops invoke God's presence for peace and unity. 36 state bishops invoke God's presence for peace and unity in Nigeria. And that story can be found on page 17 of the Punch newspaper of the Daily Sun newspaper this morning. And next really is I move to page 25 of the Daily Sun newspaper. It says Nigeria's oil production hits 1,829 MBD as OPEC approved increase. That Nigeria's oil production hits 1,829 MBD as OPEC approves increase. You can turn into page 25 of the Daily Sun newspaper this morning to read more on that story. And still on the Daily Sun newspaper front page headlines, it says how LG's autonomy can curb insecurity. How LG's autonomy can curb insecurity, and that is coming from stakeholders, and that can be found on page 27 of the Daily Sun newspaper this morning. And then lastly, on the Daily Sun front page newspaper headlines this morning, and that takes us to page 8. It says SEPRAP gives federal government 24 hours to withdraw gag order on reporting of terrorist attack. SEPRAP gives federal government 24 hours ultimatums to withdraw the gag order on reporting of terrorist attacks. You can read that on page 8 of the Daily Sun newspaper this morning. And then with that, I move to the Nation newspaper. Along the major news headline, it says state repayment of $2.1 billion threatens workers' wages. State repayment of $2.1 billion threatens workers' wages. You can turn into the Nation newspaper this morning to read more on that story. And then I move above the major news headlines on the Nation newspaper this morning. It says invest stake 5.8 billion naira on bank in dividend rush. Investors stakes 5.8 billion naira on banks in dividend rush. You can read more on that on the Nation newspaper this morning. And then I moved above the major news headline, and that's on page 7, and it says state of insecurity, and that's in Oyo State. Said Ibadan Obas Council Fort Makinde. Ibadan Obas Fort Makinde on insecurity in Oyo State. You can turn into the Nation newspaper to read more on that story. And then also read is Senate reps explain position on electoral bill. Senate reps explain positions on electoral bill. You can turn into the Nation newspaper this morning to read more on that story. And still on the front page stories of the Nation newspaper, it says Lagos APC Council poll candidate gets flagged. Lagos State APC Council poll candidate gets flagged, and that's on page 2 of the Nation newspaper. And the next to read is Banditry presidency knocks Kuka over claims. Banditry presidency knocks Kuka over claims. You can turn into the Nation newspaper this morning to find more on that stories. And with that, we move to the Nigerian Tribune newspaper. On the Nigerian Tribune newspaper headline front page this morning, it says CSO's lawyers PDP vows to reject amended clause in e-transmission of election results. CSO's lawyers PDP vows to reject amended clause in e-transmission of election results, says causes visa ban and the recall of entry NAS members. Fear grips Southern NAS members. Nigerians should insist 2023 poll is internet compliant, and that is coming from Afenifere. Electronic transfer of results possible, that is coming from the telecommunication company. Electronic transfer of results possible. And then APC PDP lawmakers voted against committee recommendation. APC PDP lawmakers voted against committee recommendation, Senate President, and all these stories can be found on page 2 of the Nigerian Tribune newspaper this morning. And then moving above the major news headline this morning, it says federal government approves 15 billion naira revitalization fund for polytechnics, colleges of education. Federal government approves 15 billion naira revitalization fund for polytechnics and colleges of education. And this story can be found on page 19 of the Nigerian Tribune newspaper this morning. And then I move to page 21. It says APC grants waivers to new members returning executives to contest crown guesses. And this story can be found on page 19. Next to it is on alleged assault. On alleged assault, it says CCT chairman to Senate Lawan AGF others. CCT chairman to Senate Lawan AGF and others. And this story can be found on page 29 of the Punch newspaper, of the Nigerian Tribune newspaper this morning. And then coming below the major news headline, and that's on page 30 On page 30, it says it's wrong to appoint non-degree holders into varsities governing council, also tells federal government. It's wrong to appoint non-degree holders into varsities councils, also tells federal government, and that's on page 49 of the Nigerian Tribune newspaper this morning. And then I come below that on page 26, it said road accidents claim 16 in Osun State. Road accidents claim 16 in Osun State. And then on page 27, it says one dies as 40-feet container crushes two vehicles on Otedola Bridge. One dies as 40-feet container crushes two vehicles in Otedola Bridge. And that's on page 27. And then lastly, on the Nigerian Tribune newspaper this morning, say bandits kill 13 policemen, 2 others in Zamfara State. Bandits kill 13 policemen, 2 others in Zamfara State. And it says release one adopted Bantu student on health grants. Is release one adopted Bantu student on health grants, and that's on page 27 and 29. SEPRA gives federal government 24 hours to withdraw gag order on reporting of terrorist attacks. And with that, we've come to the end of the Nigerian Tribune newspaper headline, and then I move to the Guardian newspaper this morning. The Guardian newspaper this morning on the major news headline says high prices deprive faithful of Salah celebration amid declining inflation. High prices deprive faithful of Salah celebration amid declining inflation. You can turn into the Guardian newspaper this morning to read more on that story. And then I come below the major news headline. Below the major news headline, I have no herbal cure for COVID-19 yet. NAFDAC insists no herbal cure for COVID-19 yet, and that is coming from the NAFDAC boss. You can read more on that on page 4 of the Guardian newspaper this morning. And the next, we still on page 4, it says CCT chair sues Lawan Malami, others over his probe for alleged assault. You can turn it to page 4 of the Guardian newspaper this morning to find more on that story. Another NAF jet reportedly crashes in Kaduna, force react. Another NAF jet reportedly crashes in Kaduna, force react, and that's on page 6 of the Guardian newspaper this morning. And then on page 7 of the Guardian newspaper, it said you're not doing enough on security. Ibadan Traditional Council tells Makinde he is not doing enough on the issue of insecurity in Oyo State. And lastly, on the Guardian newspaper this morning, says Nigeria's 2022 digital switch over target uncertain as federal government slows on timeline. Nigeria's 2022 digital switch over target uncertain as federal government slows on timeline. And that brings us to the end of the Guardian newspaper front page headlines this morning. And then we move to the last newspaper on our list this morning, and that is the Daily Independent newspaper. And on the major news headline, it says tax leakages, oil subsidy of 2021 budget implementation. Tax leakages, oil subsidy of 2021 budget implementation. You can turn into the Daily Independent newspaper this morning to find more on that story. And then I move above the major news headline. It says SEPRAP gives Buhari 24 hours to withdraw gag order on reporting terrorist attack. And then beside it is over 20 firms benefits from 100 billion naira FDI into insurance sector. Over 20 firms benefit from 100 billion naira FDI into insurance sector. You can turn into the Daily Independent newspaper this morning to find more on that story. And then I move below the major news headlines, and that's still on the Daily Independent newspaper front page stories this morning. It says bandits kill 13 policemen, 3 others in Zamfara State, and that can be found on page 6. Still on page 6 of the Daily Independent newspaper this morning, it says it's appealing It's appalling. Kuka castigated us before U.S. Congress. It's appalling. Kuka castigated us before U.S. Congress, and that is coming from the presidency. And then on the alleged assault, says CCT chairman drags victims, Senate Lawan AGF to court. You can turn into page 7 of the Daily Independent newspaper to read more on that story too. EFCC case against me won't affect my APC national share bid. EFCC case against me won't affect my APC national share bid, and that is coming from Yari. You can turn into page 7 of the Daily Independent newspaper this morning to find more on that story. And I'm still on the front page news headlines, and that's on e-transfer of results. E-transfer of results. It says, when Nigeria is ready, we won't deny INEC use of it. When Nigeria is ready, we won't deny INEC use of it, and that is coming from the Senate President Ahmed Lawan. And the next is on page 7. OPEC said upward adjustments on crude oil production starts August. Upward adjustments on crude oil production starts in August. You can turn into page 7 of the Daily Independent newspaper this morning to find more on that story. And lastly, on the Daily Independent front page stories this morning, and that takes us to page 2. It says, mob burns 5 suspected kidnappers to death in Edo State. Mob burns 5 suspected kidnappers to death in Edo State, and that's on the Daily Independent newspaper this morning. And with that, we've come to the end of the Gallery TV newspaper review this morning. Don't forget to join us by 12 noon for more updates on our news stories. I am Titilayo Olamide. Thanks for watching, and you have a lovely day.
In life, you can never be too sure who to trust. This is the story of Mrs. Ungazi. Mrs. Ungazi just wants to use the ATM.
Good afternoon, Mama. Let me help you out to your withdrawal. You don't need to stress yourself.
Thank you, but I can handle it myself.
The man is just being kind, right? He just wants to help, right? Wrong. All he needs is a good look at the pin. Will he succeed?
To my IG fans, I say, sorry.
Do not share your card pin with anyone. Keep your account information private and ensure no one is watching you while you enter your pin. UBA, Africa's global bank.